Thank you, Nicole, and welcome to all of you. We are so delighted by the response that we've had from all of you to this formative offering of Canadian Physicians for Life on the virtues of resistance. And to begin, I'd like to share a little bit about what led to this project and to this passion. When I was 18, I traveled on the March of Remembrance and Hope Holocaust study trip to Germany and Poland. It was a trip that I took with 60 other students from all across Canada and two Holocaust survivors from the Toronto area. And that trip was completely decisive for my entire trajectory that followed. It was on that trip of facing up to life and death questions, questions of morality and mortality, and walking hand in hand with survivors to the site of their trauma, engaging the ethical questions that really lit a spark for my own engagement with ethics and with humanizing the world. And that was because it was during that trip that one of our guides said that dehumanization is at the core of genocide. And I thought, if dehumanization is at the core of genocide, what's the opposite? What's the antidote? And if all of these crises that we were studying came from a misunderstanding of the human person, then who understood the human person adequately? From whom could we take our inspiration and learn how to live and work and study well? And so that was a long time ago. And more recently, just this past summer, I decided it was time to update my Holocaust education, and I participated in another trip that really lent all of the inspiration for what we're going to do together. I was invited to go on a Holocaust Educators Scholarship Program offered by the Canadian Society for Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, and they have branches in other parts of the world. And so the Canadian Society for Yad Vashem exists to educate Canadians specifically about the Holocaust, and they had hoped to bring educators to Israel. That was put on hold for the time being. We will hopefully get to go this summer for the second half of the program. But in place of that, they decided to bring us to Germany, to Berlin for 8 days. And so that's where our study tour began. And one of the sites that I found the most tremendous among all the Holocaust sites that I have ever visited was a very uplifting one. It is the German Resistance Memorial Museum in Berlin. And this memorial museum is where there are so many figures of the German resistance commemorated. And this actually brought me back a little bit to when I was 18, because when I was on that initial Holocaust study trip, one of the two survivors with whom I had traveled, Fagi Libman, told us, she said, I never speak about the Holocaust when she goes to schools or when she is invited anywhere without first of all speaking about the righteous among the nations. The righteous among the nations are those non-Jews who, at risk to themselves and with nothing to gain personally, decided to risk their lives to save Jews. And so Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel, has a database of many, many people who have been so honored. And the man who we will study tonight is among that database of righteous among the nations. And so I was so delighted to, for my first time this past summer, discover the German Resistance Memorial Museum, which is actually fairly recent. It was built in the place where those who had been part of an attempted plot to assassinate Hitler, where they had then been executed. And so this memorial museum began to commemorate more and more a wider and wider network of resistance figures to show, even if there wasn't a massive concerted effort, even if the efforts at resistance were, we might deem, and justly so, inadequate, we need the lights of these figures of resistance in order to do any relevant education today about what this history is meant to teach us, because the facts of history alone do not teach morality. It's through contending with people who faced up to difficult ethical dilemmas and who made choices under tremendous constraints that we can begin to see our own summons to heroic virtue whatever our background and whatever our walks of life. So I was really captivated by the German Resistance Memorial Museum that did a whole update, became multilingual, became more accessible to people just as recent as 2014. And as part of the broader network of the German Resistance Memorial Museum that covers, again, resistance figures across different professional backgrounds and across different religious and cultural backgrounds, there are also some other adjacent museums, and one of them is the Otto Weidt Museum, commemorating the workshop where this I mean, man, he would never have thought of himself necessarily as a resistance figure, made all of these choices that involved courageous action amidst tremendous constraint. And so that exhibit is also fairly recent. It's in a very touristic district. I learned that there are about 90,000 visitors per year. It's also very close to a place where there's an Anne Frank museum. The main Anne Frank museum is in the Netherlands, but of course, there's also one here. And so that this Museum of Otto Weidt's Workshop for the Blind opened just 20 years ago in 2006. And before that, there was pretty much just a plaque there. And now, step by step, both the German Resistance Museum and the Workshop for the Blind are, yeah, just becoming open to so many more visitors by having these multilingual exhibits, by becoming more accessible to visitors with disabilities. They're really mounting an effort to tell the story of German resistance. And this has taken some time because it's not without controversy for Germany in particular to commemorate the resistance. It's one thing to have the Dutch Resistance Museum. It's a whole other thing to have a German Resistance Museum. And of course, there has been skepticism and controversy about the legitimacy of magnifying stories of resistance again when it could have just seemed so inadequate to the need, and there were so few figures of resistance. But the brightness of the figures of resistance shines all the more against the backdrop of those who went along and those who did not necessarily exercise virtue in a way that we would consider exemplary and worth studying all these years later. So I think these places are super interesting, and I'm glad that you responded to our invitation to do this study because the purpose of reading a little bit each week together and discussing it is to kind of travel there in our imagination, in our moral imagination, and then in the discussion that we're going to have together after I quickly sketch the details of the text. So as a reminder, we will propose about 10 pages of readings each week. We strongly recommend and encourage you to do this in advance. Still come, even if you are unable to do it in advance. As we mentioned, it will be more enjoyable to contribute to the discussion if you're able to prepare. And as you can see with the readings that I propose this week, I also try and include some of the artifacts, photographs, letters, things like that, that bring the fact that these are real places and there are real artifacts of this history that you can go and touch and see and read and listen to. And we want to make that a little bit available to you now to delve into. So, um, yeah, I recall that at the entrance to that German Resistance Memorial Museum, there's still a plaque that says, with reference to the resistance, "You did not bear the shame, you resisted. You bestowed eternally the vigilant signal to turn back by sacrificing your impassioned lives for freedom, justice, and honor." So the purpose of this study that we do together is some leisurely intellectual study on Monday nights, but also for us to, in whatever way we are called, make this impassioned, make this sacrifice of our impassioned lives for the sake of justice, and to be fired up by these noble examples. So with that, I'm going to turn to a quick sketch of this history of Otto Weidt and his workshop for the blind, which has become, yes, this kind of symbol. It has become enlarged in scope, and while we can discuss whether that's legitimate, I think we can also glean something is here for us. So The first thing I want to mention that struck me about Otto Weidt is that he ended up running a workshop for the blind and for those who were blind, visually impaired, and hearing impaired Jews in his factory, that he had become blind himself. The text tells us about his failures in business, his failures in his marriage, but his adamant desire to resist National Socialism and to, through some strategic means, negotiate that his workshop was necessary during the war and to persevere in giving a place to these workers. One thing that I found most striking as we consider what are the backgrounds of these people, might we designate their particular form of resistance, and I'm struck by how he described himself as an anarchist and an individualist. I'm just looking for this particular page. One moment. Uh, so yeah, he initial contact with anarchist circles. Right, here we go. Sorry, let me just grab my other set of notes. One set of notes has some underlining. Right. So on page 4, his personal convictions for his entire life, referring to him as an individualist anarchist. So you've got this gentleman, he has kind of grows up in poverty, has some challenges with his marriages, some challenges with his business. There's also, I think, a kind of humorous mention that he turned away from organized anarchism, so a bit of a paradox there. But what do we make of his motivations? Because perhaps some of the Christian resistance figures are more known to you, and we will certainly study them. But it's interesting to consider how people can resist from all kinds of motivations, and sometimes what we might think are very unlikely motivations, in fact, maybe even incoherent motivations. What is an individualist anarchist doing, risking his life, deciding to shelter Jews, people with disabilities, through employment in a workshop in Berlin during the war? How do those fit together? It's noted that after going almost entirely blind on the same page, page 4, Otto Weidt became a brush maker and opened his workshop for the blind. What is the relevance of his own experience of becoming blind to the establishment of a workshop for blind workers like him? That's interesting too. How does our own identity, how do our own particular struggles and constraints also bespeak a kind of uh, mission, identity and mission in that regard, even if we don't reflect on it necessarily at that level? So on page 5, we see that Veidt appealed that his production was important for the war effort and bribed the Gestapo officers, achieving his employees' release. I think it's very interesting what items are in this museum. It's not that big. The workshop for the blind in the original place where he had his workshop now has some items under glass cases. Some of the postcards that were sent, along with the help packages, even to places like Theresienstadt. There are the brushes, some of the brushes that were manufactured there under glass cases. There are some of the photos, like the photos included in this package, and all of the things in this reading are from the website of the German Resistance Museum. We'll be collating some different resources from the memorial museums, some of which are online, but many of which are not, some of which I actually picked up at the museum or that I took photos of at the museum, and I'll be compiling for you. So interesting to see this group photo, this team photo of the employees at the workshop for the blind from 1941. And a lot of those people didn't survive the war. And what is the significance of deciding to take this photo? And so as we ponder some of this together, we can also reflect what represents how we live and work together, what represents our efforts to live in truth, even in a regime where there may be many lies. And who are we surrounding ourselves with? How do they look? What do we make of our being together? So I think it's really interesting to consider those kinds of uh, artifacts. Now, there's also on the next page, page 7, some discussion of the helpers circle that formed around. And I find it interesting that it says he managed to build up several circles of helpers whom he coordinated and who were closely interconnected without all of them being aware of one another. They supported Otto Weidt and the persecuted Jews with food, clothing, papers, and accommodation, or gave warnings of upcoming raids or deportations. So these networks, strategic networks, where sometimes there's overlapping awareness of one another, but sometimes for reasons of discretion, not everyone who's on the team knows of the extent of collaboration and cooperation. And what is this for us? Do we have in our own projects and endeavors, whatever they may be, a kind of helpers circle formed around us where we know on whom we can rely and those who we can trust? Here it talks about postcards from Theresienstadt at the bottom of the same page, and how, with the support of his helpers, he sent food packages to his workers. And so, what a tremendous accountability and what a tremendous solidarity that even after the workers were deported, of course, they had worked in close quarters, and he was very protective of them to the extent that he could be. It is very cool that in this museum you can see the hiding places. And so maybe some of you are familiar with Corrie ten Boom's famous book, The Hiding Place. And it was a bit like that here, where the doorway was concealed by a wardrobe, and you can see the picture. And then in the museum itself, you can kind of go in and see how people could hide and how concrete this makes the experience, how much you kind of enter in an education that is connected to your memory because you've walked there, you've stepped there, you've touched things, you've passed through walls, and you kind of feel the gravitas of those who lived and dwelt in these spaces. And now it's a museum. And then if you go online, you can see a kind of 360 view of this museum, part of how they're really trying to increase their digitization efforts and things like that. So there were some successful rescues, but there were also failed rescue attempts. And I put those both there because let us consider we will have successes, we will have failures. And sometimes it can seem like the failures really outweigh the successes. But then when you see those names, or especially if you see the faces of those who were successfully rescued, you can really kind of appreciate the value of each one. And that's the name of the Holocaust Museum in Israel. It's drawn from a verse from Isaiah, and it means a place and a name. And so these memorial museums are also really dedicated to humanizing victims and rescuers and survivors by giving them a place and a name, not only in plaques and monuments, but also in trying as best as possible to tell their story. So Otto and his wife were recognized as victims of fascism, but also righteous among the nations. And so they are among those now tens of thousands who have been commemorated with a certificate and with a ceremony to acknowledge that they were not Jewish, they risked their lives to save Jews, and they did not do it for a specific incentive. They did it at a risk to themselves. And we can see even how recent the naming of the central station was, 2018. And so step by step, this history is unfolding. Step by step, Germans are beginning to realize that the resistance is a basis for ethics education. And for many, many years, that was impossible, focusing on the resistance. We'll come to that in some later sessions. It just seemed untenable. It seemed dismissive. It seemed insensitive. And now there's a space for it. And so with that, I'm going to open it up for discussion. We have a really eclectic group of participants, a really exciting mix. So with that, I'll let Nicole maybe help with the moderation a little bit, and we will take it from here. Thank you for joining us once again.